Well, hello, and welcome back to the Patristica YouTube channel. I'm Jack Bull, and I'm joined by Marcus Vincent and Mark Bilby. And before we kick off today's video, we've got a whole range of wares and interesting things to show you and pitch to you. Starting off with this amazing, thanks to Mark, new Patreon channel for Patristica. Now, for those of you that have been subscribed to me for many years, I am truly grateful for your support. But now is the time to head over and move your subscription away from me into Patristica so that you can support other wonderful scholars apart from me, but also because it shows your support for the channel and the work that we're doing. I'll put the link down to that in the description for you to check out. Perhaps even more excitingly, however, I also want to introduce you to Peter's Publishing. Marcus and I have just had a wonderful time in Belgium with Peter's publishers. And one of the things they told us while we were there is that all of their Studio Patristica volumes from 2015 to 2017 are now available open access on their website. And let me tell you, this is la creme de la creme of ancient Christian scholarship. Indeed, Marcus and I were there last year or 2 years ago, and we'll be there in 2027 again, presenting papers and milling around colleagues. But this is the output from that great conference. And so the papers that are present in these volumes are priceless. And the fact that you have them for free is amazing. We're so grateful to Peters for that and to the Oxford Patristics Conference. So please, again, link down in the description. Check them out, peruse them at your leisure. I'm sure you'll find enough material there to satisfy you for the next 10 years, or at the very least, until the next Patristics Conference in 2027. But before we move on to Romans, Marcus, you also have a super exciting thing to show us. Why don't you hold those up for the viewers at home?
Yeah, it's not easy to hold up because they're so heavy. So here are the Pauline reconstruction and the introduction. So the big volume here, that's the introduction to the oldest Pauline collection. And then you got 2 volumes where the reconstruction is being presented. Heavy stuff, but I think your libraries will get hold of them and you can enjoy reading them. But also, we agreed with Peters, sorry about that, we agreed with Peters that they are going to publish the English version of these volumes, which are already in the publishing house present. So they're being layouted at the moment. And as soon as they're ready, then we will publish those volumes so that you have also the introduction and the commentaries and the reconstruction in English language.
And you know that a series is definitely worth reading when the introduction is almost as large as the 2 volumes put together. So look forward to that in English translation. If you're a German speaker and you've got a few dollars to spare, or maybe more than a few dollars, check them out. But without further ado then, with all of that warm-up and preamble, we return back to the series that I know is probably the most loved on this channel. And this is the Marcion versus canonical Paul debate or rivalry, as it were. And I think today is probably the most excited I've been because we're dealing with the great famous letter of St. Paul to the Romans. So Marcus, why don't you take us away in Romans?
Yeah, thanks very much for the introduction, Jack. Romans is being reckoned as the peak, I mean, the highlight of Pauline scholarship and Pauline theology. Now, it is so interesting that it opens the 14 letter collection of Paul's letters, which we have in the New Testament. Having said that, it is also the biggest shift because when you compare the 10 letter collection, which is in the Marcionite New Testament, compared to the 14 letter collection, Romans is no longer, or has not been, in first place, because instead, Marcion's Pauline collection starts with Galatians. And conversely, in the 14-letter collection, it switches places with Galatian. So what is the opening and Marcionite Pauline collection becomes a 4th letter in the 14-letter collection, and likewise in the Marcionite collection, Romans comes 4th. It seems just a bit of a change of order, but it has an enormous impact in terms of theology, in terms of structure, and an outlook on the entire collection. Why? It's quite obvious. You start with a preface, you start with an opening. Whenever you read a novel or whenever you read one collection, it is important how you are introduced, because it's like putting glasses on your eyes. Before you have, if I take off my glasses, I can't see you, so I better put them on again. But the glasses give you the filter through which you read the rest of the collection. And when you start reading Marcion's collection, your glasses are that Paul immediately states that he and he alone, not by human beings, not by anybody else, not by an institution. He himself is the person who has received the revelation of the resurrected Christ. And that is his authority. In Romans, pretty differently. Here, as we have the text here, we have first the Marcionite prologue and then starts the letter. In the canonical text, as you will quickly see, Paul, and that's the opening of the canonical collection of 14 letters, Paul introduces himself as Paul, a slave of Christ Jesus. Slave is a strong word already. So that is like a diminutive, right? So he puts himself down. And then, in addition, he calls himself that he is an apostle who has been called, set apart for God's euangelion, which was pre-promised through the prophets of his in scriptures sacred. So that's the first indication which wipes out all of Marcion's approach. Because as you know, Marcion was very insistent that the prophets, just as the Torah, has no knowledge whatsoever about the Christ and the Messiah of that Christian movement. Why is that the case? Because, as Marcion claims, his Messiah, Jesus Christ, is a Messiah of the transcendent God and not of the Creator God. Only the Creator God, who then is being transmitted in the Torah with his laws and orders, and then moving on into the prophets of this Creator God. Only the prophets then advertise a future Messiah. But for Marcion, who thinks that both the Torah and the prophets have no knowledge of the transcendent God and his Messiah, the prophets, like the Torah, cannot give us any hint of the true divine and his Messiah. This, of course, sounds pretty strange because we think, oh, where did Marcion get this idea from? I think it's not that strange because it is even part of a Jewish tradition. We only need to look back to Philo of Alexandria to see that for Philo, the divine is not the creator. The divine is the fully transcendent God. And his own work and the sole work that this transcendent divine did was a bit like in Plato, the creation of a cosmos noetos, a cosmos of the ideas, a rational cosmos, but not this physical one. So the physical cosmos, Philo believed, was not done by the transcendent God. And you see the similarity and the parallelism between Marcion and Philo. For Philo, the cosmos has been created, again, as in Plato, by a demiurge, by somebody below the transcendent God. Philo says he's like the right hand, and he calls it the Logos. And you can see the differentiation between the transcendent God, who is always outside the physical aeon, That is an idea, a Jewish idea, which goes back to a Platonic idea, which resonates then in Marcion. And here, quite the opposite. In the canonical text, the Torah and the prophets are said to be the Torah of the transcendent, and the prophets are of knowing of that transcendent God. Now, there is an inconsistency, of course, when we look into second century literature, because you only need to look into Justin Martyr to get to know that the Torah and the prophets give no indication of the divine transcendent God. So a bit like in Philo and in Marcion. And Justin is very strong on the idea that every theophany, so like God appearing to Abraham at Mamre, or God appearing to the prophets, is in fact, as Justin says, a logophany. So it is the logos which appears at the burning bush in Mamre, who comes in contact with the prophets. And you can see a certain inconsistency, because on the one side, Justin, like Philo and like Marcion, differentiate between the transcendent God and the physical creator God. And yet they don't want to give up that the Torah and the prophets are giving information and are preordaining what happens with the Christian Messiah. And with this type of inconsistency, you can see that Marcion is not that off road when we put him back into the context of how Jews in the first century before our era, and then in the first and second century of our era, tried to negotiate between, on the one side, the idea of a fully transcendent God, and on the other side of prophets and Torah that somehow relate back to him. But you can see in the opening already of Romans, and that explains why this Romans letter becomes the opening door and the glasses for all canonical readers, that this linking back of Paul to the prophets is utterly important to the canonical redactors. We can also see it in the third verse. There we read, regarding the son of his who come to be from the seed of David according to flesh. So after having made the statement that it is the prophets who have preordained and promised this Messiah, of whom there is talk in the Pauline letters, it is also the linking back of the origin of this Jesus Christ, who derives from the seed of David. So it's a genealogy which is reflected back in the genealogies which we find in canonical Luke and in canonical Matthew. And so you can see how already the opening of Romans in the canonical collection draws back the reader into what he has read in the collection of the canonical four Gospels. Making that short now, you can see how both Paul of Marcion, in fourth place in his letters, and the opening Paul canonical are relating back to their respective Gospels, and hence are consistent in the outline how the New Testament by Marcion and the canonical text collection that later becomes named also New Testament are relating to each other's texts. We move back just a short space to the opening, which only appears in the Marcionite prologue. Probably in the next edition, one should put the Marcionite prologue just on the left side and not, as people think, it's also a prologue to the canonical text. Although it appears in canonical collections also as a prologue, one has to admit. Yeah. But what is said in the Marcionite prologue? We read, Romans are in parts of Italy. That's quite a stunning opening, because it tells us that the letter is not just written to a city, but it is written to the citizens of Rome which are not just in Rome, but apparently which are reckoned to be in various parts of Italy, which in a way is of course true. Although at the time that the intended, let's say, literary world is the 1st century, but it relates already to a tendency in the 2nd century where people moved towards the Constitutio Antoniniana, which in 2012 makes all people citizens of Rome and no longer just those people who are living or having been born in Rome. And you can see the prologue itself, although trying to make a case for a historical placement in the 1st century, reflect a development towards a 2nd century setting. We will also see that this idea that Romans are living in parts of Italy is being reflected quite quickly in the 1st chapter in Romans 2. We'll come to that. Now, they have been preceded by false apostles and under the name of our Lord Jesus Christ who are being induced into the law and prophets. This is a great information that is given to us, which shows that the prologues themselves, there's a bit of a debate whether the prologues derive from Marcion or from the environment of Marcion, or whether they are not Marcionite at all. Now, I think it is a pretty difficult case to make that they are not related to Marcion's ideas. I mean, given that there is already the accusation of false prophets, which of course reappears in Paul's letters. But it is one of the statements that is the big battle between the Marcionite text claiming that people have falsified his texts and also relating it to false apostle and false brothers. But here we have a criticism that people are being lured back into the law and the prophets. And this is precisely what we've just read. And this indicated to me when I was trying to do the reconstruction and the commentary on these texts, it told me that the people who have written this Marcionite prologue seem already to have known the falsified, if you like, the redacted canonical texts of Paul, because they accuse the Pauline texts precisely of what is being done and what we've just read. So that, as we have seen, the canonical Romans lures and alludes straight away to the prophets and to the genealogy of David. And that is what is being criticized in those prologues. And long way back in 2014, when I published the book on Marcion and the dating of the Synoptic Gospels, I went through Tertullian, and I have hopefully shown in that book that when Tertullian comments on Marcion's Pauline texts, he clearly indicates that the prologues he knows. So at that time, at the latest, which is in about 200 or 203 or 4, the prologues must have been part of the Marcionite collection of Paul's letters. Whether they are really going back to the environment of Marcion, of course, we can never prove, but at least the earliest version, I think, was present to Tertullian when he wrote his commentaries. Now, so far for that, we go a bit further. Yeah, here you can see the first 2 chapters of Romans in the Marcionite collection are centering on the people among the ethne. And when you read it in comparison with the canonical text, you will see scholarship on Paul's letters to the Romans have made a strong claim that at the time when Romans was written, the Christian community in Rome, and Paul never claims that he has founded that community, but just joined it by reading it, by going there later. But that this community was already a Greek community, not only because Paul writes Greek to them, but that it was a community that was largely no longer Jewish. I had years back a big debate with my fantastic colleague who was a Pauline scholar, Eddie Adams, in King's College in London, who made me aware that the canonical Pauline texts of Romans indicates that the Christian community in Rome is almost void of Jews. I only had to say him, and that was my answer, that makes the canonical text of Romans, to me, a late 2nd century or mid-2nd century, late 2nd century text. Because how would it be possible if in those early years a community in Rome would be void of Jews? And if we read the pre-canonical text, the Marcionite version of Romans, it's just the opposite. Here, the community, as you just read, is set amongst the ethne. It's not an ethnic, it's not a Greek community. It's a Jewish community that resides in the environment of Greeks and others. And it is also interesting that the letter is not addressed to Rome. So it's a reflection of the Marcionite prologue, or the Marcionite prologue is a reflection of this text, because the text continues, it is written to all in love of God, which is no longer related to any particular place. Favor and peace from God our Father and Lord Jesus. So we have two different settings, we have two different theologies, and we have two different addressees, really, of both texts. How important that is, you will see in the further part of chapters 1 and 2, because the canonical text plays on the difference between, on the one side, the Jews, and on the other side, the Greeks. And it sounds as if the text is criticizing heavenly just the Greek people. So Greek Christians and those who are not circumcised. In our text of the pre-canonical Paul, the Marcionite collection, you will see this text addresses simultaneously Jews, of course, Jewish Christians and Jews, and Greeks and Greek Christians. It speaks about the people who are amongst the law, and in the Marcionite version, amongst the law does not just mean the Greeks with their natural law, but people are addressed who are both under the Torah, and of those people who are not believing or sitting under the Torah and in the Torah, it's people under natural law, so the Greeks. But you will see when we read the text now, it addresses both at the same time. Let me just read out after the addresses here, the first and the second chapters of Romans. And we start with here. I start with the Marcionite text first. Paul, apostle of Jesus Christ, among the ethne. Ethne means the non-Jewish Greeks and other people. To all in love of God, favor and peace from God our Father and Lord Jesus. Oops. Yeah. For I'm not ashamed of the Evangelion, for the power of God it is for salvation to everyone who trusts, to Judean and to Greek. This is the first thing what I've just said to you. He addresses in this text both in one go. For the justice of God it is revealed from faith for faith. For wrath is being revealed from heaven upon impiety and injustice of humans, who repress the truth in injustice. And as you can see, wait a minute, and as you can see, this kind of wrath and this kind of injustice and impiety is addressed to both, to people, the Judeans and to Greeks. Yeah. Because knowing the God they did not glorify as God, Nor did they give thanks, but they became empty in the debate of theirs, and was made darkness, the stupid heart of theirs. Professing to be wise, they were made foolish. Now, in a canonical reading, because of the interplaced text in between, one gets the impression that these verses 21 and 22 are only or exclusively directed against the Greeks. But as we can see, reading them just as we are done, it addresses Judeans and Greeks. And both are claiming to know God. But both are here criticized for not glorifying God. Why? Because for Marcion, the people who read the Torah and the prophets, they could not know God. And hence, they could not even glorify the right God. They couldn't give thanks. And hence, he thinks that that's an empty barrel. Yeah, now we can continue. But we know that the judgment of God is according to truth on those who such things practice. And you can see he believes that Jewish practice is not very different from Greek practice. Carry on. For as many as sinned lawlessly will also be destroyed lawlessly, and as many as sinned in law will be judged through law. And again, it's still the meaning in the pre-canonical text is that this lawlessness and in law refers to both to the Torah and the natural law of the Greeks. And you can see that in what and how he develops it. For not the hearers of law are just beside God. Instead, the doers of law will be made just. How is that? When those not having law by nature do the things of the law, such ones not having law are for themselves law. So this now implies the people like Greeks who haven't got a law. They haven't got the Torah, so they themselves are their own law, but it's a kind of a natural law that applies to them. Carry on. On a day when the God judges the hidden things of the humans, according to the Evangelion of mine through Christ. If you know yourself to be a teacher, having the semblance of the knowledge and of the truth in the law, the one who teaches another, do you teach yourself? The one who preaches not to steal, do you steal? And hence, wait a minute, just go back a bit. And here you can see that the Jewish law is now referred to, because people have the Decalogue in the Torah where it's forbidden to steal. And he says, well, if you are under the law, even more so, if you teach the law, so here are the rabbis, here are the Pharisees, here are the people who are judging and making judgments in the Jewish community, then if you put yourself under the law of the Torah, you will be judged by the Torah, and you have to comply with the Torah. And I think this is an internal criticism which we also find in the Gospels, that people are claiming to be lawful, and in fact, as in so many religious and political spheres, are not following the law that they teach. Yeah, now, next part. And that's the judgment. If people are claiming to put themselves under the law, for example, by circumcising themselves or by being circumcising the children, then, of course, you have to comply and you have to hold those laws. But he says, if they don't do that, then the name of God is due to you being blasphemed. For while circumcision, and you can see how consistent the text of this Marcionite Romans is until now. For while circumcision profits if you observe law, but if you are a trespasser of law, your circumcision has become a foreskin. And you can see how Marcion's Paul argues here. He is not in principle against the Torah, but what he criticizes is that people who are imposing and who are teaching the law are in fact not complying with this kind of a Torah. Later on in Romans, we will come to that, he will say it is hard or it is even impossible to comply to this type of Torah. But then, conversely, we have Trypho in the dialogue with Justin, where Justin explains the argument by Trypho, who says, oh, I've read your Evangelion, that's all very nice, but nobody can comply to the Evangelion. So you can see the argument is being made from Christians versus Jews, and apparently if Justin is reflecting a real practice and not just a literary device, then also the argument was made against the Evangelion that likewise the Evangelion with the new law of Christ is something people cannot hold. Yeah. So we had just now, as in the beginning, where he says, well, I'm talking to Judeans and to Greeks. So what we had so far was about the Torah and keeping the Torah or complying with it. Now comes the second part, and that's more on the Greeks. And the by nature foreskin will judge you who perfected the law that is through letter and circumcision as a trespasser of law. Sorry, that's still the Judeans one. For neither in the visible is the Judean, nor in the visible circumcision in flesh. Instead, in the hidden, the Judean and circumcision of heart, in spirit, not in letter, whose praise not from humans. So here, that's the version where this Paul moves from, yes, what we suggest to be is not that we are not Jews, but that we are Jews in a spiritual sense. And that is a different form of complying with a Jewish tradition. Sorry, I was a bit too quick with my move to the Greeks, but the Greeks will come now. But we have known that as much as the law says to them in the law, it speaks so that every mouth be fenced and may become liable the whole cosmos. That's the end of that passage. Then comes at that time law, but not apart from law. God's justice has become apparent, namely through faith of Christ. Now, what's the distinction? For if Abraham by works was made just, he has a boast instead, not unto God. Well, we leave it for that because I'd like to do the Abraham bit in a second session because it needs a bit of more explanation. Let's just go back. What we have had so far, you can see, is a strong opening where Paul of the Marcionite version gives us an introduction to say, well, what we suggest here is we want to talk about the law and we want to talk about the relation, how we can still relate to the Jewish tradition. He is not anti-Jewish, but he sets an antithesis of the faith of Christ and the type of written law. But even then, he does not dismiss that type of a written law just out of hand. But he says, well, it's okay if people are putting themselves under law as long as they comply and as long as they try to do what they are teaching other people. That's fine. Nevertheless, a spiritual way of reading the law is more of what is being asked for as a belief and faith in Christ. In the side text on the Greeks, as you've seen, he makes the same suggestion. People who put themselves under law, and in fact, every human being is under a natural law, even if he doesn't know about it, that's something where we all have to stay with it and for it. I think this is a great opening and a consistent opening of this letter. When and we don't do it tonight because it's a very lengthy way, how the canonical redactors have broadened this pretty simple, not a simple one, but a straightforward opening of the Marcionite text into a very complex reasoning on the canonical level. It is so complex that it is also quite frankly often inconsistent. You only need to read the piles of commentaries on canonical Romans to see the great difficulties people have. We only need to look into one or two sections. So if we just go a bit further down. Wait a minute. Yeah. No, that's still... He, as in all letters, he has an extended praising of the addressees and a thanking to the addressees, which we never have in any of the Marcionite Pauline letters. So we move through that, but we come to here, both. Here we are 14. Just a moment. Yeah. Both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to wise and unthinking am I debtor. Thus the readiness on my part to be evangelizing also to you who are in Rome. And you can see how the canonical text now centers on the city of Rome as it's being done in the praising just in the sentences before, which we have just jumped over. For I'm not ashamed of the Evangelium, so that's the same text as we had it just. For the justice of God in it is revealed from face to face. But you can see the redactors add now explicitly, as it has been written, but the just will live from faith. So what we get in the canonical text is a scriptural reference. And Mark, you probably know by heart or by looking at it what the reference here is. He's muted.
I don't have it right now, sorry.
Okay, well, not in front of us. Good. And then for wrath of God, yeah, that's still the pre-canonical text. So we can move a bit ahead. Yeah, here we are. Stop. Because what is known of God is visible amongst them, for the God became visible to them. For his invisible things from creation of world by the creatures being considered are observed, both his everlasting power and divinity, so as for them to be indefensible. And as you remember, Marcion made a strong case, and even in the Pauline letters, as we will see when we come to Ephesians, for example, or the Marcionite version is Laodiceans, you will see that the Creator God has no knowledge of the transcendent God. But here, as we had it with the prophets, now it is an emphasis on God as being the creator of this visible world. It is just to have a bridge to the next pre-canonical text, because knowing the God and so forth. But then, at the end, professing to be wise, they were made foolish. The canonical text continues, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for a semblance of an image of perishable human, and of birds and tetrapods and reptiles. And you can see how the canonical redactors move away from this idea that the text speaks both about Jews and Greeks. And it drives the entire text towards a wrath against the Greeks. And I'm sure Mark wants to come in because he has had a look on this quite strange example here that the canonical redactors have introduced with the birds and the tetrapods and the reptiles.
Yeah, I had a variety of thoughts. I guess I can comment here, but maybe we can go back in a little bit. I was reading Miguel Vargas's UNC dissertation on the Oneid Sibyl. So it was about a Jewish or Judean prophetess, a Sibyl, based out of Egypt and the Jewish community there. And in his dissertation, he lays out how it gives us a pretty decent sense of historical events in the Judean community after the destruction of the Second Temple and into the time of Trajan. So we're kind of getting a para-narrative about what's going on based out of Egypt. But there are various sort of cluster of themes that appear in Sibylline Oracles 4 that really resonate here with the canonical text. So it uses this same word tetrapod, which is a pretty unusual, word, pretty unusual lemma statistically. But it also combines it with a critique of icons or representations of the divine in like physical form, and also with a critique of homoeroticism. So you have a cluster of quite distinctive elements in the Oneid Sibyls oracles and Sibylline Oracles Book 4 that are only found on the canonical side here, along with this quite elaborate and quite technical vocabulary. I tried to, in the translation here, make it as literal as possible. So tetrapod, we could say quadrupeds, I suppose, as well, but in Greek it's tetrapodon. Herptiles, we could say reptiles in English as well, but herptiles is more faithful to the Greek, and it is an actual English term today. But all of this quite elaborate critique of icons, sort of maybe following on to the Epistle of Jeremiah and other Judean or the longer Greek endings of the Book of Daniel, Prayer of Azariah, where you have really ridiculing of Greek worship, of icon-based or statue-based worship. So that's coming out here, and that's not really a concern on the Marcionite side at all. There's an acceptance that icons aren't real, but there's not really a ridiculing or a satirizing of icons or of icon worship. On the Marcionite side, there are other things too that we could bring up, but I find it just interesting, all the critique of homoeroticism only on the canonical side, and then the icons and all this. So my sense is that the canonical redactor may have actually taken over some of the Sibylline oracles from the Oneid community and kind of kept them alive by weaving them into this post-Tragianic, probably post-Hadrianic redaction of the Pauline corpus.
And also, I think I fully agree to your reading of it. And I think, why has the canonical redactor here made that kind of a strong borrowing on this, and at the same time an introduction of a criticism of icons? It is to remove the criticism that is being done in the Marcionite text on the Torah. Because we have a section on the Greeks, yes, but the Greek section is linked first to the criticism and the extended criticism, as we have just read, of the Torah and of the law in the Torah. Whereas the canonical redactor, he smoothens over it and almost covers it by introducing now all kinds of things which people can be criticized of as being unnatural or unlawful. So that at the end of the day, when you read the canonical text, you've lost the pattern that it is a criticism of the Torah. No, it doesn't appear any longer to be a criticism of the Torah. It's a criticism of Greeks, and particularly of Greek deviations, icons, and of course, homosexuality. And we have that in the next two phrases here when we just scroll down.
Add here too, this also puts the canonical collection a lot closer to Stoic philosophy, right? Within Greek philosophies, you had a lot of different views about sexuality and proper sexual relations. The Stoics were known for being critics of homoeroticism, and the canonical text again and again pivots toward this sort of nature is, and identifies nature with a Stoic reading of nature, basically.
That's a fantastic ending for our first session, because I'd like to pick up from here, having written a paper together with Priya Mathur, one of my former students, on homoeroticism in comparison between the canonical and the non-canonical text. We might pick up in our next session on that topic, because we can contextualize this topic even historically. And I think that's worth starting an episode. But I think for today, Romans is a first start.
Could I come back to just the beginning part and make a couple comments before we leave Romans 1 altogether, if we have a couple more minutes? It was just, Romans 1:4 comes up in debates about Christ mythicism, and it's been used to say that Paul believed in some kind of like heavenly sperm bank, and somehow Jesus's identity or Jesus's lineage comes out of some kind of heavenly thing. And that's really just a poor reading of Romans 1:4. I think what's going on here is on the Marcionite side, it doesn't really care about establishing Jesus's human lineage. And it doesn't really care about debates about legitimacy, like paternal legitimacy, or even messianic patrilineal legitimacy. But the canonical side does. That's what Romans 1:4 is about. It's establishing Jesus's legitimacy in the line of David. And it doesn't have to line up perfectly with the Lucan genealogy or the Matthean genealogies, which are mutually contradictory anyway. But it's establishing legitimacy and patrilineage in the Davidic monarchy. So it's not, one could read this actually as a euhemerist position, right, where you have a heavenly Jesus on the left, and then an earthly kind of humanized Jesus on the right. But I don't think that's what's going on here. I think there's still an assumption that Jesus is human on the left, though revealed by an apocalypse, revealed by revelation. But I think in the canonical side, you're starting to see debates being addressed about patrilineage, about legitimacy, about early Tanaitic conversations about Jesus being the son of Pantarah, for instance, which we find in Celsus, in Origen, and other fairly early witnesses to the tradition. So in rabbinic literature, there was a fairly active tradition that Jesus was not a legitimate son of David. And then I think in the canonical redaction, you're getting pushback to that, where various ways try to define Jesus as being a legitimate child within this tradition. So, as well as themes of election and predestination that are already forefronted here. I was also going to note quickly that you have commercial and mercantile language. We've already seen it several times, that exactly when the Marcionite attestations leave off, we get language of profit, of surplus, right? Those same kind of commercial, financial, economic terms that we saw all over the place in 2 Corinthians. They continue right on into Romans as well, even in ethnic conversations and contexts. But it's just a completely different perspective of, the grand scope of salvation history is being woven into the canonical redaction, where Romans is, I'd say, much more on the Marcionite side, much more straightforward paranesis about how you live your life. It's more straightforward philosophy, not grand salvation history.
Indeed. Yeah.
Well, if homoeroticism and Jesus mythicism is not enough to convince you back to an episode 2 on Romans, then I don't know what will, and will give up on you. But for everyone else, do stick with us. Hopefully episode 2 on Romans will be out shortly. And just a reminder, please do go check out those links, both to the Patreon and to Peter's, because they will unlock so much more for you in the scholarly realm. But until next time, have a good one, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.